Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now, in my last few videos I've been talking about the rite of confirmation and the rite of reconciliation, sometimes called First Absolution. And today I want to talk about the rite of First Communion, and what is this? So, in generally the Roman Catholic Church, they have three rites that you go through. When you're about 6 or 7, you go through the rite of reconciliation, in which a person is then welcome to partake in the rite of confession absolution, or the sacrament of confession absolution. And so it's sometimes called First Absolution. Then when they're about 12, 13, they go through their First Communion, in which they are now welcomed to commune in the Catholic Church. And then later when they're like 16, 15, 17, that kind of age bracket, they go through confirmation. Now, historically, the rite of confirmation is actually based on these two Bible texts. There is a third if you want to include the book of Hebrews in there, but generally it's from Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 19. And historically, what confirmation was, is it was a rite in which there was this confirming that you are in agreement with the Catholic faith. So in the case of the apostles, Philip the evangelist had established a congregation in Samaria, and so the apostles Peter and John came along to confirm that these were true Christians. Later, St. Paul comes across a congregation in Ephesus that was founded by people who had been taught by John the Baptist, or disciples of John the Baptist, so they were part of that John the Baptist tradition. They hadn't really been taught by the apostles themselves, and so when Paul comes along, he baptizes them in the Christian baptism, and then he also confirms them to confirm that they too are part of this apostolic faith. Now, historically then, when you had churches that popped up, you had like the bishop would go and they would confirm that they were as part of the apostolic faith. But if people have already been born into the church, have been baptized, gone through reconciliation, gone through First Communion, confirmation kind of becomes a bit redundant, because the idea of confirmation was to confirm that you are part of this one true Christian faith. Now, within Lutheran circles, at least American Lutheranism and Australian Lutheranism and some European Lutheranism, generally kind of more of that German tradition, confirmation and First Communion were connected as the same rite. So this is the rite that I grew up with here in Australia. It's the rite that most American Lutherans would probably be familiar with, in which confirmation and First Communion are actually the same thing. And as I've explained in my previous videos, the point of that is that since we practice closed communion, we don't welcome people to the communion rail until they've been thoroughly examined. And the point of confirmation was to thoroughly examine people to confirm that they were holding to the Catholic faith, that they were holding to the apostolic and Catholic faith that we hold to, that they are in agreement with us. And so in Lutheranism, since you're already doing that in order to let people come to Holy Communion, First Communion and confirmation are essentially achieving the same thing. So having them as two separate things is kind of redundant. If I examine people for First Communion, and then why do I need to examine them again for confirmation, unless it's kind of just a refresher examination? So that's why generally a lot of American and Australian churches have not done First Communion and confirmation as separate rites. They've generally combined the two together. Although personally, I did actually have a First Communion and then confirmation. I mean, most Lutheran churches don't do reconciliation or First Absolution. That's a whole nother discussion about corporate absolution. But for now, I'm talking about First Communion and confirmation. In Australia, the Lutheran Church of Australia went through a fad where, based mostly on their Lutheran Catholic dialogue, decided to adopt this practice of First Communion and confirmation. Now, the reason this was done for me, I mean, the reason that was given to me was that we didn't want people to try and make a big deal out of confirmation and then never come back again, because in the Lutheran Church of Australia, and this might be a problem in many Lutheran churches, they have this problem of kids are baptized, they go through Sunday school, they go through confirmation, they get confirmed, and then they rarely ever come to church, until like they're adults, they get married, they have their own children, they want their own children baptized. And so there was this big problem of the Lutheran Church Australia losing youth. And so what the decision was, well, if we give them First Communion around about 12, 13, when we would normally do confirmation, then they can start communing, and then we do the more thorough studies throughout high school, and we confirm them at a later date, so that you're trying to keep them in active involvement in the church through those teen years. Because normally kids would get confirmed at 12, and then they would stop coming to church during high school and uni and stuff like that. But by having the kids have First Communion at 12 and then have to do a confirmation class throughout high school, getting confirmed around 16, 17, that kept them in the faith. At least that was the idea. And in reality, that kind of actually did work for me, because I had my First Communion around I was nearly 13, and then I did confirmation classes when I was 13, 14, 15, and then I was confirmed when I was almost 16. So I had communion, First Communion, and then I had like a 3 years confirmation. And that actually really helped me stay in the faith. It kept me firm in the faith. It meant I kept going to something with the church. It kept me involved in the church during those, valuable years of formation. Especially during high school, you have a lot of struggles with things like atheism, or neo-paganism was a big thing when I went through high school, and I just really enjoyed having this weekly confirmation study that I could go to, especially since my local church, we didn't have youth groups and Bible studies for the youth. So having something for me to go to every week, which was confirmation, I found very valuable. And I would say that that's actually one of the reasons why I stayed so strong in the Lutheran faith and went on to go study for the ministry and become a pastor. So I actually did find some value in this idea of having First Communion and confirmation. Now, personally myself, I didn't want to do it that way. I think that since the purpose of confirmation is to give you a thorough examination to confirm that you are in agreement with us, and that's the same thing I would do for First Communion, I didn't see the point of having them as two separate things. Because if I had First Communion and then confirmation, well, either I'm not doing a thorough examination before First Communion, which is bad, because that's not how closed communion works. Closed communion is, if you're going to commune at our rail, you should believe, teach, and confess the same things that the congregation believes, teach, and confesses. So therefore, there should be a thorough examination before First Communion. But if I'm going to do a thorough examination for First Communion, then I don't really need a thorough examination for confirmation, unless I'm just doing like a re-examination and that. So I kind of thought, if I did a thorough examination for First Communion, doing it again for confirmation is kind of redundant. So I've tended to stick with this, what I call the American Rite. Rite is R-I-T-E. This American practice of doing confirmation and First Communion as one practice, because I didn't see the point of doing a thorough examination for First Communion and then a thorough examination for confirmation. Although I have liked the idea of doing some kind of post-confirmation study with some kind of a re-examination for kids later. So like, they get confirmed around 12, and then when they're about 18, we do like a second confirmation, or a reconfirmation, or an affirmation, or a post-confirmation, just another thing. So I mean, I could just call them the terms that the Catholics have and do for reconciliation, First Communion, confirmation. But I think just historically what confirmation is meant to be, I would prefer personally to keep confirmation and First Communion connected as one practice. And I mean, you can do this. You see this in Scripture when St. Paul rocks up in Ephesus and he baptizes these guys. He baptizes them and confirms them on the same day, and you would assume he'd also start giving them communion. So he's got baptism, First Communion, and confirmation all in the same day. So you can have these rites combined. You don't have to space them out as, okay, you're baptized, then you do reconciliation, then you do First Communion, then you do confirmation. You can have them combined if you want. However, because these are not sacraments, but they are church rites, you can also keep them separated. And while I here in Australia tend to have First Communion and Confirmation combined. Pastor Magnus over in Denmark doesn't. Now that is generally a historical traditional practice in the Scandinavian Lutheran churches to continue this practice of reconciliation, First Communion, Confirmation. Now, with Pastor Magnus, he does do the thorough examination for First Communion, and Confirmation it's more of like a rite of manhood, or a rite of adulthood over there in Denmark. So you kind of have your baptism when you're a baby, you have your reconciliation or first absolution when you're about 6 or 7, then when you're 12 you go through your First Communion, you're examined, you're welcome to commune, and then when you're older you go through this kind of another examination, and a re-examination, a second confirmation essentially, in which it's more like, okay, now you're an adult in the church, you got to look after yourself, you're taking responsibility for your faith. So you already can commune, and in that sense you do take responsibility for your faith, but you're still a child and your parents are going to be there to look after you and watch over you. But now when you go through confirmation, it's kind of now you're an adult in the Christian faith. It's like a rite of adulthood over there. So there's nothing wrong with that practice either. So like I said, personally, I like to keep First Communion and Confirmation combined, just because of the way I think that if I hold a closed communion, having Confirmation and First Communion together I think is important practice. Although personally I would like to have some kind of reconfirmation or an affirmation or a second confirmation for older teens, just to make sure that they're staying in the faith and to keep them involved in the church. But if you want to do the traditional practice of reconciliation, First Communion, Confirmation, that's fine too. The thing is here, they're adiaphora. They're not sacraments, they're church rites, and so yeah, you can break them up and divide them how you want. You can even do them more often. I know Pastor Wolfmueller of the Missouri Synod, he was talking about the idea of pretty much breaking up confirmation into several steps. And so he has like this really like a junior confirmation for kids about 6, and then when they're about like 8 or 9 they go through like the second stage of confirmation. Then when they're like 11 or 12 they have another step, and then when they're like 16 they have another step, and then when they're 18 they have another step. So I don't know if he does it in his church, he just talked about this on one episode of Table Talk Radio, of this idea of taking confirmation and breaking it up into like, 5 to 7 different steps, and like on the 3rd step is when they're 12 and they can start communing, so First Communion. But that confirmation itself is like this lifelong practice, and that the kids come back like to do this confirmation ceremony and rite like every 2 or 3 years, just as this way of setting down these milestones and markers and keeping this active ongoing involvement in the church. So that's a practice as well. And it's really, you can do it any way you want, and I've got it the way I like it. Pastor Wolfmueller's got it the way he likes it. Pastor Magnus Sorensen has got it the way he likes it. It's adiaphora. Go for it, and I just hope this has been some good food for thought. And I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.